Congrats, everybody. We've finally made it to the end of the semester and almost to the end of my incessant droning. We only have about 6 minutes left of that last one. So let's go ahead and get into it. In the first part, we talked about the history of Tanzania. In this one, we're going to be discussing the current issues facing the country. Where I'm also going to convince you that the problems they're facing, they're not responsible for it, neither are their neighbors. To do so, we're going to look at maps, and we're also going to be looking at social development in the nation. At the end, hopefully, you will know that their problems aren't their fault, and neither their neighbors. So, for the last presentation, I asked you to remember 3 things from the 3 topics we talked about. For the pre-European influence section, I asked you to remember that before they became involved with Europe, the region was extremely affluent. They had massive trading empires that ranged across the continent throughout this entire period of history. One of them in particular that was rather powerful in Tanzania was known as the Tanzania Empire, and they actually named the Atlantic Ocean the Ethiopian Sea. Just a cool little bit of history there. For the European influence section, I asked you to remember that the Tanzanian people suffered hundreds of years of colonization from 3 different empires, the Portuguese, the British, and the Germans, not to even mention the Omani Arabs, who originally helped them push out the Portuguese, but later also colonized them with the help of the British and the Germans. And then for the post-European influence section, we ran out of time, so I didn't get to talk about it. But all you really need to know for this part is that the country is less than 60 years old. It's very, very young in terms of nation's ages. So we're going to go ahead and get into this one now. In part 1, we covered those topics, and 3 topics. This time we're going to cover 2, so we don't run out of time. We're going to talk about maps and social development. So maps. I know they don't really seem relevant, and most of you are probably asking these 2 questions. Maybe not that first one so much, but you really should. They're incredibly complex tools. Nat Geo describes them rather vaguely as a symbolic representation of selected characteristics of a place. Those can be anything. It can be what ethnicities live there, what resources are available, what the topography is. It's extremely vast. But how does this relate to the discussion? Well, see, maps used to distinguish a country's borders are just inept at taking into account the different ethnic groups that live there. Well, okay, what does that have to do with this? To explain this and the severity of it, I'm going to take you a little closer to home. We're going to do a little bit of talking about the almost war between Ohio and Michigan in 1885. See, in 1885, Ohio joined the United States, and Congress drew the maps. What Congress didn't do is talk to Michigan to see if they had any claims to land. Michigan had actually claimed all of this land several decades prior. So when they weren't there to discuss the maps being created, the land was stolen from them. So you ended up with militias occupying Toledo to try to claim it for both states. Congress had to get involved and the issue was solved. That's rather severe for just a little strip of land. What's interesting about this is that there aren't any ethnic conflicts between Ohioans and Michiganians, as I call them. But in Africa and Tanzania, those issues are extremely prevalent. There are tons of ethnicities present that are constantly fighting each other. So when imperialism ended, these maps of Africa were redrawn, not by Africans, but by Europeans who felt they knew the people better than they themselves did. And this led to these massive ethnic conflicts all across the continent. And then because of this ethnic conflicts, we had genocides, wars, famine, general instability. And this all happened because Europeans drew a map that ignored those different ethnic groups. If you don't believe me, feel free to look up these conflicts. For the 2 that most relate to this topic, we have the Rwandan Civil War and the Burundi Genocide. See, during and after these events, hundreds of thousands of people fled their countries into Tanzania to seek shelter. Currently, Tanzania is housing 278,000 refugees and 40,000 asylum seekers. That is a huge burden for a country that is 60 years old. As a matter of fact, the amount of debt that they've taken on, it went from 28% to 40% in just the last 4 years from having to maintain that population. So, in short, through European meddling, they have ignited ethnic conflicts all across the continent, which has caused mass migrations of refugees, which has put tremendous strain on the various nations who have to take care of those refugees. Now we're going to kind of jump into social development here. So we have to ask, what is social development? Well, this long explanation is rather terrible. Social development is really just governmental policies that help the people who live there. Anything from police institutions, fire departments, roads, hospitals, schools. And what factors contribute to it? There are all kinds. Anything from group cohesion to access to clean air. For this case, we're going to talk about wealth distribution as it relates to poverty. And to really get into that, we need to go back in time a little bit and ask a question. And that is, what is the goal of colonialism? The goal of colonialism is to exploit as much as possible to get the most out for the cheapest price. So what does that mean in the long scale terms? It means you end up with nations that build mass infrastructure networks that aren't in place to help the people who live there, but to help the people who live there. So you end up with railroad networks that connect mines to ports, or roads that connect ports to mines, or plantations that go nowhere. So when these nations develop or finally declare independence, they don't have any infrastructure to support themselves. They have to cover that themselves. It all comes out of pocket. So for a nation that's 60 years old, it immediately had to establish all of those social safety networks, get the general infrastructure built, and then on top of that, because of the massive ethnic conflicts that flared up, they had to take care of the refugees. It is an incredibly complex issue that the Tanzanians face. And now we'll kind of backtrack here to talk more about the wealth distribution as it relates to the poverty. It's really an easy discussion since we covered what we did in the last slide. It's normal for people to suffer and die just due to preventable diseases. It's normal for people to live off of less than $1 a day in rural communities. It's normal for people to never learn how to read, but there has been significant progress by the Tanzanian government to provide for its people. The Human Development Index, they've raised several places within the last decade. And they've also made significant progress towards the Millennium Development Goals as put out by the UN. So in conclusion, European influence caused long-lasting ethnic conflicts that have destabilized the entire continent. Their issues, their story is one of just barely scraping by and facing the odds. You now know and are able to understand that articles called The Case for Colonialism by Bruce Gilley are absolutely garbage. You know that there is no case for colonialism. The notion is disgusting. Thank you for your time.